afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Fuse Games Conference, a completely online and free conference from Staffordshire University's Games Department. Our next guest is a freelance 2D digital artist who brings a wealth of experience from their time in the industry and through their mentorship roles. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Arne Billen.
Hey there. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's always interesting to have these conversations with, hopefully a few people, because I do think there's a lot of interesting subjects to share. All right, unless there's any delay, I shall
we're going to bring in our co-host as well, Joe. So Joe is another lecturer at the university. For everybody that isn't a part of Staffordshire University, and I believe a friend of Arne's as well.
Yeah, so I've been teaching at Staffs for about 3 years now on the concept art course, everything from perspective drawing to digital painting and whatnot, lots of design. And I've known Arne here for a lot longer, for about 5 years, so good friends, yeah.
All right. I have prepared a little bit of a presentation, so I'll introduce myself in the presentation, if that's okay. Yeah, cool. Let's get straight into it. Let's see. Add Google Slides. Here we go. Oh wait, you said it was better to share just the full screen, right? Okay. Share screen. Things should be visible unless I'm mistaken. Everything going okay?
Just waiting for it to pop up into screen.
Okay. Just a full screen. How about now? Perfect. Okay. Welcome everybody. So I'm going to have a bit of a talk about personally my art journey and my journey into the industry, because I've had quite an interesting journey into the industry, because I've been quite a few things over the past few years. Of course, right now I am a part-time lecturer and a part-time freelance concept artist who mostly works on indie games. Also have a mentorship on CGMA, where I, of course, teach many students. All right, so who am I? My name is Arne Billen. Arne is what most non-Dutch speaking people call me. I'm a concept artist from Belgium, and I have been a concept artist for, let's say, about 3 to 4 years at this point. So my journey has been quite interesting, because I actually graduated as a physiotherapist about 4 years ago. So in 2019, I got my master's degree as a physiotherapist until I moved into digital art. At the time, I didn't really know what exactly I wanted to do, as I imagine most aspiring artists struggle with, because, of course, there's so much out there. There's so many options as an artist, and so many roads to take, basically. In 2019, I discovered that art really started becoming an option for me as a career path, because I managed to partake in quite a few online challenges, etc. And in those challenges, I did fairly well. Never won one, but at least, people liked my stuff, gave me enough confidence to then take that next step into actually, pursuing an art career, which is a very scary first step to take. From my experience, there's many people out there that want to have an artistic career, and some people come from doing art like throughout their entire life, art school, into college, into uni. Other people discover art later on, like me personally. So the year after my master's degree in physiotherapy, I took a mentorship with Tyler Edlin. So Tyler was one of the artists that was hosting a bunch of challenges, like every month, a challenge of the month that I participated in. And those challenges, if you partake in those challenges, you get a chance to get some personal feedback. And that feedback is what pushed me towards Tyler, because I knew, like, okay, yeah, he's a reliable source of information. It's around that time that I met Joe, when I was doing that mentorship. And until that time, I didn't really have a very clear idea on what it took to become an artist, which is something we'll discuss later in the presentation as well. And very interesting subject as well, because everyone has a very personalized art journey, at least as far as I've experienced. So during my mentorship with Tyler, I had a bunch of studies done. Those studies were done alongside Joe. Once I did my mentorship, I decided, okay, now this is something I want to commit to. I've discovered within that broad range of digital art, concept art was actually the thing that lied closest to what I found interesting. So I moved into the direction of concept art, took a concept art course here in Belgium, which lasted for about a year. And then 1 year later, in September, is when I really got my first concept art job. Now, as far as I can tell, from the start to taking art seriously to my first job, it's only taken 2 years, and that seems like fairly fast time. But I will say, the reason that it went so fast is because I did put in like quite a lot of time and effort. My 1 year concept art course that I wanted to take, unfortunately, didn't really teach me the things I wanted to teach. The lecturing materials were fairly surface level, not too many in-depth subjects. So I was really required to take the initiative and, put in a lot of extra hours. So outside of school hours, I was just studying until I was at a point where, okay, now I'm comfortable with creating a portfolio. I send out about, let's say, 60 emails to jobs and studios that I found interesting. Not necessarily had a job application open, sometimes just like a little spontaneous application, let's say. Got about 60 no's before I got my first yes. Funnily enough, my first yes came from a Twitter post from an indie game studio in the UK that was working on their first game called The Player's Attic, which was then my first concept art job. And as you might have heard before, that first job really gets the ball rolling. Once you get into the industry with that first foot in the door, the other jobs tend to follow up fairly quickly. And between then and now, I've worked on, I think, 4 to 5 video games, some other smaller projects. I've mainly been teaching. So at Sintra here in Belgium, I teach the fundamentals of design, figure drawing and anatomy, character design, and set and prop design. I also teach at CGMA, where I taught Tyler's design fundamentals of design course for a while, until I moved on to the design mentorship by Hugh Theo and the digital painting course by Lane Brown. And since last year, I've gotten my own design mentorship with my own lecture material, which has obviously been the latest big milestone in my career. So the reason I got this far is because in that time frame between 2019 and 2023, I've done about 3,000 studies, and studies can be anything from figure drawing sketches to full-on paintings. Those 3,000 studies are, people talk about the 10,000 hours it takes to master a skill. It's probably going to be more than 10,000, probably. But that's really what has gotten me to progress from 2019 to 2024 to be a full-fledged concept artist working in the industry that's very comfortable and confident in his own skills. So yeah, journey from physiotherapist gone artist, quite an interesting journey, and these are the biggest milestones in my career so far, at least. Who knows where my art journey will take me next. This is some of my work. Most of my work is very colorful because I have gone fairly niche. I work in the indie game industry, mostly known for more stylized projects. While Yonder was the first gaming project that I worked on, like I mentioned earlier. And personally, also a very just fun first start and first experience in the industry. Some more of my work. These are some demos that I have for my design mentorship at CGMA, among other paintings. As you can see, a wide variety of things, because I'm a firm believer of the fact that you should always be good at everything, but you can always excel at one thing. And what we want to do is we want to get a very broad skill level. So we want to know our perspective skills, our figure drawing skills, and we want to level them up at the same time so that we can take on any job we want, because that's eventually what's going to make you the most hireable, most desirable as a 2D artist, like those fundamental skills, so that you can be sort of a chameleon in the industry and take on any style, any job. Flexibility is going to be a very big part in what makes you hireable in the end. So to quickly frame what I do, concept art, as most of you know probably, is a job in the pre-production phase, which is creating art to help visualize ideas in that first phase of the pre-production. So a project can be divided into the pre-production, the production, and the post-production, of course. Pre-production is all the preparatory things before we start actually fully creating the project. And concept art particularly, you can roughly divide into character design, environment design, props and assets, VFX design, and visual development. Of course, there's other things, more niche things like creature design, industrial design, etc. But in my opinion, they all kind of fall under the category of one of these. And this is some of the stuff that I did for, once again, that first project with the Player's Attic. So I did some characters, character iterations, interior work, and vehicle designs. So like I said, be good at everything. Like, I applied for that job. I got that job because my portfolio showed that I would be able to fulfill any task basically in the project, which has caused me to, for my first project, be the, well, quote unquote, lead concept artist. Of course, doesn't really work that way in the indie industry, because there isn't really a strict concept art team. You have just a bunch of freelancers working together. And I was the main concept artist that came up with the style of the game, got to design a bunch of the main characters and the main ship for the game as well that you would travel in, which was crazy to think about for a first, gaming industry experience. If we think about the pre-production, it's the planning phase of a project, so conceptualizing the idea and writing the initial documents. That means we have in that planning phase the producer of a project, the writer and the director. Of course, the producer is going to provide the money, the writers are going to write the idea, the directors are going to direct the project. All makes sense so far. Personally, I'm not, of course, any sort of planning guy. I only come into play in that third part, the exploration stage. The exploration stage contains many different jobs, but the concept art job is obviously the main interesting one in this talk. And we are going to try to visualize the ideas that were thought up in that first planning stage. So usually you'll get a brief, follow the brief. You'll go through a couple iterations, and your design will be there to then move on to the production phase, where the concepts will actually be created for the eventual project. In my case, like game development. So usually, depending on the style of game, there's going to be a 3D artist that's going to need your work. That's why the concept artist need to be ready to pitch in the production phase as well, because we need to provide support art in case our designs maybe aren't clear enough, in case during the production they realize, oh, well, actually this doesn't work, or we need something else. Like a fun story, for example, that I have from a game that I worked on. I came up with a mechanic for a vehicle, and we needed to sort of portray a map. And I had this idea of an entire holographic map. It was a very cool idea. They really liked it, but then it came back to me and said, well, it's cool. We would love to put it in our game, but we don't have the budget. So during the production phase, I had to go back to phase one, basically, readjust the design so that it worked well with the 3D art. The game I'm working on right now, similar issue. I'm creating the 2D art. Need to provide it to the 3D art. Sometimes the 3D artist has some questions like, okay, how big is this compared to something else? What are some other elements that could be part of this design? What textures does this need to be? And then you need to just, once again, take your design, readjust it, send it back so that everything stays consistent within the game. So in that production phase, concept art still plays a big role. So it's not necessarily just strictly, start-finish concept art. It kind of flows throughout the entire project depending on what they need you to do. Another thing is, if you have those fundamental skills, you can sort of pitch in with any job in that production phase in case that's necessary.
Hello. I'm going to interrupt you slightly. We've got a question in the chat. So I think I already know what your answer might be, but Sunny Elf in the chat says, do you have any advice on how to upkeep 2D skills? Small projects or speed drawings? What could be good to practice on the regular? Anatomy, composition? We tend to have this a lot with people, is that they have so many topics available to them to learn. How would you go about sort of making a list of priorities to keep you focused when you're studying?
Good question. So one of the main things that you need to keep in mind when you want to practice your 2D skills is you don't want to level up one skill till it's like maxed out and then move on to the next one. You kind of want to chop things up into bite-sized pieces. I see a lot of people that want to get into, for example, character design. And of course, for character design, you need to know figure drawing. You need to be able to draw like a character, like a human body. You need to know anatomy. You need to know gesture. All those subjects. The thing is, any of those subjects is way too broad to tackle. Like if I say, "Oh yeah, I want to learn how to draw like anatomy," okay, which part? You know, because anatomy is such a broad subject. Like I said, I'm a physiotherapist, so I know pretty well how complicated anatomy can get. Plus, setting a goal like that, like I want to learn how to draw anatomy, that can be a lifetime goal. So you'll only really get that success experience once you have reached that goal, which can be years from now. But if I say, oh yeah, I want to learn how to draw not just anatomy, I want to learn how to draw realistic characters. Okay, so which character? I'm going to learn how to draw men or women? Sure, I'm going to learn how to draw men. Okay, skinny men, buff men. Okay, maybe skinny men. Young skinny men, old skinny men. Okay, so I'm going to learn how to draw old skinny men. Sure, now I've specified things, and within that like subject of old skinny men, now I can move into like the specific anatomy features. So okay, how would the face look? How would the expressions look that the face would make? How would the forearms look, the shoulders, etc. Come up with a routine where you can separate those subjects into very specific bite-sized pieces. Study those like 1 week at a time. Say, okay, yeah, this week I'm going to be practicing, let's say, young. Like most people start with just the peak physique men, basically, right? So yeah, I'm going to start off with just an average man, and I'm going to start learning the gesture first so that I know how to draw a dynamic pose, which is most of the time a fairly good start. I'm going to do some gesture drawing, get the flow in. Once I have gesture, I'm going to move into mannequinization, as in adding form to those gestures, practicing not losing that form. Once I've done that, I can start moving into the specific anatomy subjects, like, okay, now I want to learn how to draw the shoulder in the next week. And if you compile that for like 50 weeks in a row, you'll have 50 subjects that you've now specialized in for a week's time. And a week doesn't mean like, okay, 2 to 3 drawings a week. That means like every day. Of course, you can take a day off, but usually the way my routine works is I wake up at 6, I get an hour or 2 of drawing in, I leave for work. Work is teaching in this case. I come back from work, and since I've done my drawing in the morning, I don't need to bother with doing studies in the evening unless I want to. Sometimes I'll go to the climbing gym, I'll grab my sketchbook, take that with me, and draw some people in the climbing gym. Gestures, for example, might be interesting. And that's how I can keep busy with a certain subject all week long. Another important thing is to, when you are studying a particular subject, like anatomy, for example, don't just do 50 weeks of anatomy back to back, even if you divide it up into bite-sized pieces, because it's always going to be more interesting to shift focus every so often. Like I said, you want to excel, you want to be good at everything. So do a week of anatomy, then maybe a week of perspective, and then we'll do a week of lighting, and once again a week of anatomy, and we sort of loop back. That way we can keep ourselves interested. We level up all our skills at the same time, rather than max out one skill first and then max out the other second. Because as you can imagine, if I'm doing 50 weeks of anatomy and I'm suddenly like a master at drawing anatomy, like I'm very, very good at drawing these very real life, like realistic figures. They look nice, they have interesting shapes, they have nice gesture, etc. Like that's good. And then I need to tackle a subject that I've never tackled before. Suddenly my skill goes from here to here, and that's very disheartening. You'll notice that you won't be able to keep up the practice because suddenly you suck at something while you're used to being good at something. While if you level up every skill at the same time, so 1 week of this, 1 week of that, another week of this, another week of that, you level them up at the same time, and it'll be much easier to continue to practice that way. The easy answer is use a sketchbook. Sketchbooks are very accessible. Take it with you anywhere you go, whenever you're waiting for a train, waiting for a bus, waiting at the dentist. take out your sketchbook, get a little bit of practice in. That mileage is really going to pile up after a while. So I hope that answers your question. Because I do think this is interesting.
It is a really interesting topic. I 100% agree with the idea of just keeping a sketchbook on you all the time. It seems like every successful concept artist I know is just always drawing non-stop. One of the interesting things about this, if you're proposing that you can really dive into these subjects and study them bit by bit for a while, an element of learning in that sense is going to be this idea of a feedback loop. And thankfully, when we were studying, we had each other for that. But how do you recommend students go about actually analyzing their own work? Because you don't just want to study for that. You don't want to do 3,000 studies without any form of introspection or checking yourself.
That's a good point. So when you are trying to learn a new skill, there's a bunch of theory that goes with it, right? And I'm a firm believer that you need to know how to do it the proper way before you get that intuition to do it like in a more organic way. Intuition is really important, but everyone is kind of born with a base level of intuition, and that intuition might lead you to know what looks good, but not necessarily know why something looks good. That's where the theory comes into play. Luckily, if you're probably watching this, you're probably in an art school, so you're getting that theory. And I would definitely just like summarize the main important fundamentals. Like, for example, when I'm teaching design, I'll summarize the design fundamentals into, okay, so you have big, medium, small. Arranging your big, medium, and small shapes in a way that offers some variety and keeps things appealing. Secondly, you have your shape language. So you have the different kind of shapes that tell different kind of stories that we know convey a different feeling to a design. Thirdly, we have our ratios. So we know that we don't want 50-50 splits, because that's probably going to lead to a confusing design, as opposed to something that's 70% pointy, 30% rounded, for example. That way we can very clearly see in hierarchy into what is more interesting than other things. And then fourth is the design, like shape design, just being able to create appealing shapes. That's a list of 4 fundamentals, a very brief list that I give all of my students. I have them write it down, have them write it on a Post-it note, put it next to their designs, and when they're designing, they have to go through that checklist. Okay, have I applied this? Have I applied this? What about this? And what about this? Once they've gone through that checklist, they have to design it again and apply the changes that maybe weren't following those rules. And redrawing something that you've previously drawn can teach you a lot about, first of all, the things that you might have struggled with at first, because you're kind of figuring things out as you go, usually when you're designing or drawing. So that helps you create that feedback loop. So don't just settle at first drawing and say like, oh yeah, I'm going to do a study. Well, this study took me an hour. I'm happy with it. Sure. Do that study again. And you'll probably be able to do that in half an hour. Because you've learned quite a few things. You can apply those feedbacks that you can provide yourself based on the theory that you have, which will then lead you to really internalize that information rather than it just being a checklist on a Post-it note. That makes sense?
Yeah, that all makes sense. I think that's really good stuff. I'll let you continue with your PowerPoint.
Cool. All right. If any other questions pop up, feel free to ask me. Like, this is my day job as well. So I do really like to dive into these subjects. But this kind of ties into some of the things that I still want to discuss in this presentation, which is, for example, what can a concept artist do? Well, first of all, our drawing fundamentals. And our drawing fundamentals are something that, like we mentioned earlier, need to be practiced like all together. Again, the sentence, be good at everything, excel at one thing, should really be an important sentence to you, because this is really something that I carry with me, and I believe that it's a pretty large reason for why I have been as successful in the short amount of time that I have been creating art. The important thing to realize is that drawing is not just lines on paper. Drawing is actually accurately arranging your elements on your canvas, right? The way we want to arrange these elements is by using our abilities of observation drawing in order to get, so that we know how to get our proportions right. Because, for example, if I do those separate anatomy studies, Like I know how to I've learned how to draw the shoulder, the wrist, the face, the feet, the knees, the elbows, whatever. I still need to connect them and get those proportions right. Those are all things that you can learn by using reference, by using real-life reference preferably, because that observation drawing is going to really learn you how proportions relate to one another to get like an accurate representation of the thing that you're trying to draw. Aside from that, we have constructive drawing, which is building and manipulating 3D form, composition, making sure that we can place our elements in the right place, and composition goes broader than just environments. If I have a character, the rules of composition still apply to that character. I do still need to know where the satchel on this character is. I need to know where the button on the character is. Things that are sewn in, details that I put on my character, the way a jacket is worn, etc. That's technically all still composition. Like it all ties in together pretty neatly. And finally, we have design. Design is a very important drawing fundamental. It helps creating appealing shapes. Those appealing shapes are very important to get a nice illustration down. I know a lot of people that are very good at drawing. They're not good at designing, which means I can draw a pretty tree. Well, I can make the tree look pretty, but the tree has a boring design. Therefore, it's not interesting to look at. But if I know how to design something interesting, plus make it look pretty, well, then I'm a concept artist, right? Also know your software. Less important than the drawing fundamentals, but if you want to be a professional in the industry, knowing your software really is important to save time in your general workflow. But I do want to emphasize the time saving mainly happens with skill and knowledge. Where I'm at with my current skill level, I know Photoshop pretty well. I know Blender to the extent of creating detailed blockouts. That's something I can do. What I can't do is texturing in Blender. Well, I could probably, if I would commit to learning how to do it, but at this point, I've painted so much that painting it is just quicker than texturing it. Like last year, I started a concept piece for a job of mine, and I started drawing a building, and I thought to myself, well, this is going to have to be used from multiple angles, so I'll just make a 3D model to make it easier on myself. I probably wasted 2 to 3 hours getting the 3D model right. I wasn't able to get it to read as well as I wanted it to, so I said, well, okay, this is not going to work. I'm just going to skip to the 2D phase. I'm not going to do the 3D part, and I'm gonna draw it in perspective. And I actually had my drawing within 20 minutes of my design, and from the other angle had it within another 20 minutes when I had spent or wasted almost 2 hours in Blender. So knowing your skills and knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are will help you save time as well. And at some point, you'll notice certain things are just faster than others. My skill set really leans into the 2D side of things, which means that's a faster workflow for me, as long as I can deliver my 2D art as quickly as someone who does know 3D. I'm as hireable as that other guy is, because I'm as reliable to work with, because I can meet the same quota basically. So save time with your skill and knowledge, not necessarily with the software. But the software is going to provide you some shortcuts to really optimize your workflow, let's say.
Hello. I've got some more questions for you. So I got this one from Dusk. It says, hello, do you have any advice for getting a better understanding on color or rendering in a piece? I find that my pieces can sometimes feel a little bit flat. So advice on rendering or getting something to feel 3D. Okay.
It actually begins with, funnily enough, not necessarily color or even values, because rendering really begins with the drawing. And the drawing is not necessarily, like I said, just lines on paper, but knowing how to draw three-dimensional things will help you then know how to paint three-dimensional things. Because if we summarize it briefly, and I believe this is something that Joe uses in his classes as well, the whole painting ladder or painting pyramid principle, that I believe Craig Mullins proposes. Correct me if I'm wrong, Joe.
Craig Mullins and Devin Cohen, I think, yeah.
Oh, yeah, there we go. So that's the idea that we basically have 4 steps to create a finished painting. Step 1 is going to be the drawing, so that's going to be the proportions, the perspective, the composition and the design, and in case of characters, of course, the anatomy, etc. That's all drawing, accurately placing those elements. Once you have that in your scene, you can move on to the values, which is the second step. And values is planning out your lighting, basically grouping your values, what's going to be light and dark. But the important thing with values is to realize, and we can go on an entire lecture on this if we want to, but I'm going to try to keep it short. So for values, we want to clearly group our values between the light family and the dark family, basically, because that's what's going to offer a very graphic read to our paintings. And if I quickly go back to some of the examples that we have over here, for example, what you might notice is when you squint your eyes, they all still have that three-dimensional form and they all are still readable. It's mainly because I am arranging my values in a certain way where the shapes that I've designed, again, shape design, drawing, the shapes that I've designed are describing the form of the object. Yeah. So this shape of light is not just a blob of light, and people tend to forget that your brush strokes, or the shape that your brush strokes are forming, basically, are a very powerful tool to describe that initial form, because once I have these two groups separate, my painting has three-dimensional form. Even without, even if I would turn it black and white, it would still read as if it's a three-dimensional form. So designing those shapes to describe the form accurately is the first thing. Once we have that, of course, we want to very clearly keep those light and dark groups separate, so that we can retain that graphic read. And then once we have those first two groups, that's when we can start worrying about, okay, so other values in there. So I have my main light source, for example, in here coming from the left-hand side. That's my number one light source. There isn't really a second light source unless you consider the bounce light to be a light source. But those bounce lights, I'm not going to worry with in the first 20 minutes of my painting. Then I'm going to be putting in those bounce lights that are describing the rest of the form. But those can't interfere with those first groups that I've separated. Once I have planned in those bounce lights and I have my values accurate, I can move into color. And with color, it's mainly going to be contrast, not necessarily between the exact colors that we need, but mostly between warm and cool, in my opinion, at least. And warm and cool can be expressed in many different ways, like saturated versus desaturated is a very big thing in showing off a warm color, because of course if I have a orange and I have a desaturated version of that orange, that's still warm and cool respectively compared to one another. But that parameter of warm colors and cool colors is very clearly going to help you separate those value groups even more clearly, because that's another layer of contrast that you've added, which then can in turn help with the three-dimensionality. These value groups are also going to prevent muddy colors in the future, and those warm and cools as well, because muddy colors tend to usually happen when you start, first of all, putting too many separate colors close together. I think that's probably a big thing why most paintings fall flat, because if you see, at any of these paintings, it's probably 2 to 3 colors that you can pick out. I have a red, a purple, and a green in this painting, basically. And maybe some color notes of some oranges and some blues, but if you color pick those blues, you'll notice they're not actually blues, because color is very, very relative. So the main thing carrying a painting like this is going to be the levels of saturation and those warms versus those cools. And I hope that sort of answers things. But once again, just start from start to finish with that painting ladder principle.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is I find that with a lot of our students, it's almost like this sunk cost fallacy, where something's not quite reading as 3D, feels a bit flat, and the response from the student is always, okay, I'm going to make my brushes even smaller, and I'm going to render even harder. And actually, it's about taking that step back and reevaluating these core things like the drawings, the shapes that you're using, and using those to make something feel 3D. Damien Sharman says in chat, he says, can you quickly go over the checklist again so he can write it down? So that's the sort of shape language, that kind of a thing.
The design checklist, you mean, that I mentioned earlier?
Yeah, the design checklist from earlier.
Okay, so we have big, medium, small. So big, medium, small. That's mainly the shape, the size hierarchy. That's important. So that's number one, big, medium, small. Secondly, shape language. So in class you probably learned this in the sense of, oh yeah, so you have your squares, you have your triangles, and you have your circles. Yeah, can be a little bit restrictive. I usually divide it into, organic versus inorganic, so very solid shapes versus fluent shapes. I think that's a bit more of a loose way to think about it, but once again, knowing those core shapes like our triangles, squares, and circles is still a benefit to learn. And then afterwards, when your intuition catches up, you can keep going into any direction you want. So once again, to repeat, first, big, medium, small. Second, shape language. Third is going to be our ratios, or we could call it so our dominant versus our accent shape, for example, in case of shape design. But it's actually ratios because it applies to everything. So for example, this painting over here, it's dominantly green with an accent of purple, right? There's a very clear hierarchy in which color is the primary color and which one is the secondary. If you look at the second painting over here, it's dominant cold, 70% cold, with like 30% everything within here basically warm, right? And within the design, we can do the same thing. Like my design is 90% or 70% square, 30% round, let's say. Like for the people that I've watched up, usually an example I give is Carl Fredrickson, because that man is basically just a cube. He's a square. But there's, I believe, 2 round things in his entire design. His nose is round and his bow tie is round, which gives him a softer edge. But that hierarchy, like if he would be like 50-50 round and square, like he wouldn't really look as stubborn, let's say. So that's the third fundamental. So once again, to summarize, first we have our big, medium, small. Second, we have our shape language. Third, we have our ratios or our dominance and our accents. And then finally, we have our shape design, creating an appealing shape, making something look interesting, make something look appealing. The way we do that is basically avoid parallel lines, because parallel lines only offer one direction to go into, or well, 2 if you go perpendicular to them. But from the moment I have my parallel lines and I start skewing them towards one another, I start adding a bit of flow to my design. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind there, and of course, within the time frame that I have right here, I can't go too in depth into it. But that's just a general piece of advice, I guess, especially for organic design. That's important. So 4 fundamentals: big, medium, small, shape language, our ratios, and our shape design. Sorry, a fire truck is just passing by. Hope you can't hear that. So I hope that clarifies things.
Yeah, I think it does. We've got thank you in chat, so we'll take that
Okay.
as a yes.
We'll take that as a yes. So where were we at? We've covered this. We've covered this. Oh yeah, that's interesting. Next up, we have the work of a concept artist. Like I said, I mainly work as a freelancer. I work on indie games, which means that my job goes a bit broader than a concept artist job would go when I would be working in a studio. Because if you work as a freelancer, you're probably going to have a lot more tasks to complete, a lot more steps to take. At the moment, I'm working for a company, working on indie game dev, on an indie game, and the game devs themselves aren't artists. They are programmers, which means I'm getting little to no artistic guidance, which means a lot more of the defining and the research phase falls on me. If you would work in a studio, defining would already be done for the most part, right? Like, you know exactly the project that you're working on, you're getting your brief, it's very strict, there's an art style that you need to follow, etc. That's all defined, and the research, if you're lucky, they'll provide you with a couple of mood boards that are fairly extensive, maybe even an entire file of text that you can use. In my case, I need to do a lot of defining and researching myself. Define is for the most part, okay, what do I need to design? For who do I need to design it? Why do I need to design it? And by when? The by when is important for me personally so that I can have good time management. What, of course, the subject, for who's the target audience, why, like basically, what is the kind of project that I'm working for? Is it going to be a a 2D game, a 3D game, a side scroller, an isometric view, a third-person game. All things that need to be defined, and all things that are going to inform your decisions on, for example, how you're going to finally finish your design. Next up, we have the research. The research is mainly to expand your own visual library so that you familiarize yourself with the subject you're about to design, right? Like, for example, if I need to design a creature that's roughly, let's say an alien horse, right? Well, first, I'm probably going to do a bunch of horse studies so that I know the anatomy of a horse. I know how to apply that. I'm not just going to wing it and create a random shape and say, oh yeah, done. I'm probably going to have to do some research to expand that visual library to make sure that I know and understand how things are working. Especially important when you're doing more non-fiction stuff, like more historical stuff, because then we need to know architecture and culture and anything that like needs to be realistic, basically, like the smaller details that the general audience won't think of. That's what you as a concept artist need to bring to the table. Like most people, and we'll see this in a bit, when they draw a house, they have their basic idea of a house. When you say, okay, like reinforce the roof, they'll probably put in a crossbeam. That's about the extent to which people know architecture, the average person at least. If you say you want to do architecture in a feudal Japan setting, in feudal Japan, they didn't use nails, for example, to put together a house. It's basically just wood sculpted into a form so that it fits perfectly in together, which will cause you to design in a very different way rather than, let's say, Western Europe, where you have, oh yeah, so I'll have a wooden plank, a hammer, and I'll smack a nail in and it's sticking to a wall. Very different reason of designing, only things we can know when we do the proper research. So that's all our functional research, the things that define the function of the thing that I'm trying to design. And we have our aesthetic research, like if I want to get a certain aesthetic, certain vibe, I might want to look to pre-existing projects for inspiration. The important thing to remember is inspiration, not copying. Don't pick one project as an example. Scramble together a bunch of images that you like, preferably even in real life if you can, to get that aesthetic reference, that aesthetic research. And cultural is just so that you're dealing with cultural aspects appropriately and not being unrespectful to the things that you're taking inspiration from. I can't emphasize enough how important these two phases are as a concept artist, because that's really gonna prevent a lot of issues that you're gonna run into in the later phases of the design process. Next up, when we are designing, thumbnails, color iteration, and how am I gonna finish it, like rendering, etc. Iterating those things is gonna be very important during that designing phase. And then finally, we have our refine phase, which is render your design so that it's finished, it's presentable. Technical breakouts, very, very important. Something most recruiters look for, and something most like graduates tend to forget about. People like producing the finished rendering stuff. People don't usually like doing the technical breakouts, but the technical breakouts show that you went the extra mile, and that's probably going to be your junior job anyway, doing technical breakouts of pre-existing designs. So very important, the breakouts that are necessary for the particular project that you're working on. Aside from that, an orderly presentation, present it in a nice way, make it look appealing. Takes 5 minutes to arrange something neatly onto a sheet, but it really makes a big difference in how professional your work is being perceived, basically. So keep this in mind. I definitely think this is important, and this is an example of my personal work, once again, for my first project that I worked on, which is unfortunately, up until this day, the only project that I'm allowed to share any visual stuff for, because usually when you sign an NDA, that lasts for quite a while. So the define was, in this case, was made by my employers. I got an entire history. I got the appearance, and I got the layout of the ship. So I got a lot of information ready to start designing, which was very useful. The research was rather limited, but a little bit of a visual style guide, at least, of, yeah, this is the aesthetic that we want. So that worked out pretty well. And I went into designing, and this is kind of a funny story. Like, I did all of these thumbnails in, let's say, an hour, 2 hours. sent them to my client. My client said, yeah, no, kind of heading into the right direction, but not quite. Did another bunch of iterations, send it over again. Kind of, but yeah, it's not getting quite the vibe. By the way, the brief for this was a space cargo ship that was converted into a sailboat, but it also had to look fast and agile, which were, in my opinion, conflicting elements. Fast, agile cargo ship was very conflicting in my opinion, and the agile wasn't in the original brief, which was why my first designs were very bulky, because, freighter, cargo ship. But then I had a call with my employers because I really couldn't figure out what they wanted. So I said, okay, would you mind having a little bit of a chat? Explain to me exactly what your idea is, what you want. And during the call, they explained it to me, and I sat there like, oh, okay. And I did a 1-minute sketch as a demo for them, which turned out to be this little crappy drawing. And they liked it. And that became the eventual design. That's this ship underneath here. So kind of a funny little story, funny how that went, which is once again why that planning phase is very important. Get all the information you can to avoid issues later on. Yeah. Important thing to remember as well, the quality of your design depends on the creativity of your solution. To put it simply, this is a house. This is not a design of a house. This is a drawing of a house. This is, I guess, a design of a house, but it's just a nicely drawn house, in my opinion. Not necessarily a design, because it doesn't really have a lot of personality. This is where we get into a design. We have designed appealing shapes. We have added some storytelling. And now we're getting to that point where I would say, oh yeah, this has a bit of personality compared to the first house, which is kind of the template symbol or icon that most people think of when they are designing something, right? Like if I tell you guys to design a castle, most people think of, oh yeah, so I'll have a gate in the middle, 2 towers to the side, and then a conical shape at the conical roof at the top. That's what most people think of when you say design a castle. But of course, as a concept artist, we want to be more creative than that. So we want to think out of the box to create the most interesting option for a particular brief. To put it briefly, don't do what most people would do. Do your own thing. Finally, I think we're getting close to the end of the presentation. So how can you be successful? First of all, it's going to be important to define success. Success is something that can be very personal, at least. And I think most people in the industry are very hung up on, or most people that want to get into the industry, rather, most students, let's say, are very hung up on the idea, I'm only a successful artist if I'm being paid to do art, which is a little bit short-sighted and kind of taking the essence of artist away from being an artist. Because in my opinion, like, even though I haven't worked on the biggest projects, like I work on indie games, and I like working on indie games because it provides me a certain amount of freedom. Like I haven't worked on a Magic the Gathering or worked for a AAA studio, but I consider myself to be a successful artist because I feel like I'm at a point in my artistic journey where I can create whatever I want to create. My skills aren't limiting me anymore to create interesting things. Like if I have an idea, I'm now able to put that idea to paper, which is the biggest success that I could hope for in my artistic journey. Doesn't matter whether I'm getting paid for it. Like I just want to create what I want. And if I wouldn't have made it into the industry, I probably would have found a job and kept art as a hobby, and I'd be perfectly satisfied with that. Like I could have been a physiotherapist. But I did make it into the industry, which was a nice bonus success. But the main success is still, no, my skills are at a point where I can do what I want. And that's honestly a very, very nice thing to have. What increases your chance at being successful? It's probably going to be work ethics. Work ethics is something that Joe and I have discussed quite often, and we've joked about creating a podcast together about this sort of thing quite often as well, which who knows, might happen in the future, but we'll see. But work ethics, like your opinion of what is a good amount of work, what is a sufficient amount of work, will really define how much work you are willing to put in. and your work ethics are defined by, in my opinion, personal ambition over professional ambition. Kind of loops back into the idea personal success over professional success. Because if my only success experience would be getting into the industry, then in my entire life I would only have one success experience. Plus that success experience as a student might take a couple of years to get there, which is a very depressing thing to think about. Like, oh yeah, I will only feel like I'm a success if I get that job, like that one success experience. While if I have personal ambition and I want to work on my own skill, I want to improve. Every time I master a new subject, that is a success experience. So rather than once in a lifetime, it's now every 2 weeks, basically, which keeps you going for quite some time. Okay? All right. Final thing that I want to say is just enjoy growing and creating, and no job will be too hard, because if you enjoy the process, like, doesn't really matter what kind of gig you get. And as a concept artist, like I said, you need to be flexible and you need to adapt to the project that you're getting. So to put it into a little bit of a nice sentence, if you like to walk, you will always walk further than those who only enjoy the destination. The art journey is difficult, but it's a very rewarding one. And I am very glad personally that I went from being a physiotherapist to this, because this is much more rewarding than the other options would have been. So far, I believe that's my presentation, at least. If there's any more questions, feel free to ask. If not, Joe and I will have a bit of a discussion about more things. In the meantime, I have some time lapses to just put on while we have our conversations.
Good.
All right.
Good. That was a very nice talk. Very nice presentation. It doesn't look like we have any more questions in the chat at the moment, so I'll ask you a question of my own.
Mm-hmm.
So you're referring to a huge amount of work that you put in to get where you are, talking about how much people are individually willing to put in to get their personal successes. How do you recommend that people balance that with some kind of reasonable work-life balance? I know you mentioned going to like climbing gyms and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How would, if you were a student, you were teleported back in time, you're a student again, and you have to dedicate a certain amount of time per day or per week, how would you arrange your time and organize it in a healthy and productive way?
Mm-hmm. I think having a healthy work-life balance all kind of depends on how you balance the things you enjoy versus the things that you must do. I believe Joe has a video even about art should not be fun, and to a certain extent, that is true, because like it's impossible to find everything fun that you do, right? Because when I am trying to learn a certain subject, sometimes I'll get very frustrated, and it's not really a fun process, but it's just something you have to go through. The way I did this with my patients, because like I said, I used to be a physiotherapist, which means I have some experience with getting people to do things that they maybe don't want to do, like exercising. It's mainly try to combine it with things that you actually like, because usually whenever you feel like you have this crippling fear of getting started, it's first of all due to a lack of preparation, but also kind of because you just basically don't really have a clear idea of what it is that you want to do. So in order to get a nice and productive lifestyle going, it's I would personally divide your life into certain, or your day, let's say, into distinct blocks. So like I said, before I moved to work, I have 2 hours of studying. That's study time. That's just painting for fun. That's non-professional work. That's me just loosening up, practicing the things that I want to practice, etc. Then I have my work that I have to do, which is from 9 to 4:30. During my lunch break, unless I'm not being antisocial and talking to my colleagues, I will probably be sketching as well. Because my lunch break, sketching is relaxing for me. So even sketching within your comfort zone, even if you're not trying to learn a particular subject, it's still going to help you improve, right? So just being busy at any time you can is gonna passively grow out your skills anyway. And when I get home, until I have eaten, I probably won't do any work. That's relaxing time. That's me playing a game, me reading a book, me going for a walk, me going climbing, let's say. So I'm not going to do anything work related. That's very strictly, just relaxing and fun time. Once I've eaten, the evening starts. So that's like 7 p.m. And that's when I can decide whether or not to go and sit behind my desk and do the work that I might still want to do. And I think just creating very clearly like separate blocks in your life, like this time is reserved for relaxation, and I'm not going to touch that relaxation time. Like that's almost like part of your schedule. You're gonna probably be fine with balancing things out. Like if a friend asks you, like, hey, do you want to hang out on Sunday? And you really looked forward to just relaxing on Sunday, well, that's just an appointment that you've made. That's not spare time then. That's your relaxation time. So I'll just say, no, I am busy. I'm busy with doing things for myself. I'm busy relaxing. So I don't really feel like doing something else. And that's important to set those boundaries to get that relaxation time in as well. If you want to be productive and you want to put in that amount of effort, well, it's mainly finding in those small gaps in your day where you can put in some effort, where you can start working on some things, like, for example, when you're waiting on the train, when you're waiting on the bus, when you're sitting in the train, when you're having a lunch break. That's all times of day that you can practice. And especially when you're a student and you don't have work to worry about yet, it is important to set large chunks of the day aside for studying, because I believe, like, when you don't have a day job, the studying is the day job. That's your responsibility at that point in time. That's your way of making sure that you get that end goal of that day job, right? So it's going to require a lot of work. You're going to still have to set aside some spare time, but do realize if you're being a student, a 9 to 5 isn't unreasonable to ask. Because when I was still practicing and doing the studies with Joe, probably was closer to a 6 to 8, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Probably the times where I was painting and working on my stuff. And by doing that, within 2 years' time, I managed to get my first concept job, let's say. Sounds harsh, but it is definitely worth it. And once again, I refer back to the point that I made about enjoy the process. Then the studying won't feel like studying, and the work won't feel like work. It's just relaxing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely the key, because I do remember when we were studying from 6 a.m. till whenever, and it's almost like you didn't notice the time going by because it wasn't a chore. It's something that you enjoyed doing, which is good. We have a question from Sunny Elf in chat, which is, do you have any tips for standing out when going for industry jobs? Any industry tips or portfolio tips, I guess, in this case?
Standing out is at the same time difficult and not difficult, because people think standing out means to think that it means that you need a unique style, which isn't necessarily the case. Style doesn't determine whether you stand out or not. It can help, but if anything, if you want to get into the industry, having too niche of a style is unproductive for a portfolio, right? Now, how do you stand out in the industry if you need to have a similar, art style as other people do that are working in the industry? Well, it's going to be the fundamental skills again, and might feel like it's a gimmick at this point, but really those fundamentals, there's like every day probably a couple thousand artists that are applying to jobs. A couple hundred of those thousands of artists, or maybe like, let's say 80% of those artists are applying with just a very particular skill set and probably a lack of fundamentals, because the fundamentals are harder to come by in aspiring artists than you would expect. Also, I've sort of seen it firsthand, because of course I have taught a bunch of students at this point. There's a bunch of students that come from an art school, they go through high school, they do some kind of art course, and in that art course they learn a lot about fine art and all about like doing your own thing. What they don't learn is like perspective drawing and composition and anatomy. They've done figure drawing and model drawing, live model sessions, but they don't know how to do anatomy. If you in your portfolio can show, yes, I understand perspective, I understand lighting, I understand color, I understand anatomy, then you're standing out, because that means that you would be able to do anything. Because you can draw any three-dimensional form that you want, you can light any three-dimensional form that you want, you can draw any character that you want. Portfolio-wise, how would this look if you would create a portfolio that would be appealing for the industry? Well, think about it this way. You kind of need 3 projects. One project that is aimed at the job that you're aiming to get. So if you want to be a fantasy environment artist, so do some architecture design for a fantasy village. Do a keyframe for that fantasy village, like a nice illustration, nice painting. Do an entire project that is centered around that singular goal of, this is the job that I would like to do. A second project, that's more of a fundamental skill project. That's showing off, I can do anything like this. Doesn't really matter what subject it is. It's mainly a project that is there to show that you understand perspective, there to show that you understand lighting. Just a fundamental skill project. And then the third project that you want to have is a passion project, not necessarily related to the job you're aiming for, just related to the thing that you like doing. And that's going to bring that personal flair, like, the thing that you like to do, the thing that you enjoy, so people can understand, this is this person's personality, this person's preference. You have the job project that shows, this is why this person is applying, because you don't want to apply to a job and have your possible future employer say, okay, so what are you applying for? Because your portfolio is just too all over the place. And then that fundamental skill project, maybe like an entire folder of figure drawings for life drawing. And life drawing isn't contained, by the way, to people. Life drawing means go outside, draw a building, draw the church tower, whatever it is that you find interesting enough to sketch out, basically. And I thoroughly believe that those fundamental skills will help you stand out. But aside from that, it's also going to be, of course, networking, which is a whole different subject that I might dive into, unless Joe has a follow-up question on any of that.
We've got not on any of that, but we've got two other questions to get through. How much time do we have left, Rob?
We're pretty much good to go for a little while yet, if you want to carry on.
Okay. Yeah, no worries.
We can carry on. Damien Sharman in chat says, do you have any tips for getting faster at both sketching and digital painting? For me, the hours tend to flow by without much work to show for it. So how can they speed up, or should they even be thinking about speeding up?
So you might have noticed, but speed is not a fundamental. Speed is something that is handy when you're working as an artist, when that's your profession, but it's not necessarily a goal that you're working towards. It's not just something that sort of passively grows as you get better at things, because if your skill improves and you get more confident, and confidence is really the key to getting faster. The way I look at it, when you think about speed, ironically for me personally, to get faster, I had to slow down. Because back when I was doing my studies first, it's a funny contrast to what you're seeing on screen right now. Because first, when I was doing studies, I was all over the place. I was just, texture brushes, random messes, and then I'll sculpt that into a figure. Sure, it worked out. That wasn't really teaching me to do very structured sort of work. While slowing down and being a bit more deliberate with the brush marks that I put down, with the drawing that I put down, making sure that first phase, again, to refer back to the painting ladder principle, that drawing stage is in order, making sure that is right, saves you a lot of time in the future. This is something that I actually realized 2 years ago, or I don't remember, maybe it was last year. we went to Playgrounds, concept art convention in Berlin, and I met Evan Amundsen there. Some of you might know who he is. And I bought a book of Evan Amundsen, asked him to draw a sketch in the book for me, because I ran into him like just at the event, sat next to him, and he started sketching. And the funny thing is, he was moving so slowly with his brush marks, but every brush mark was just the brush mark that he wanted, which meant no undoing, no erasing. It's just very slow, deliberate drawing, which means that in a couple minutes' time, the painting was the drawing was finished. So slowing down means speeding up in a sense. It's more about being more deliberate with what you do, learning to be more deliberate rather than just quickly slathering paint on the canvas, because that's going to result in a mess more often than not. So that's my main advice on that. Slow down, be deliberate, understand what it is you're drawing, rather than just quickly try to get something down on the page. That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I completely agree. We've got one more question from Ian Naylor, which is, when you talk about fundamentals, it often implies this kind of sense that there's a set of rules that someone has to follow. Is there any way you like to break those rules to add interest to your designs?
Oh, for sure. Most of the time, actually. If you really think about it in concept art, in truth, there's only really one rule that you need to know, and that is, if it looks intentional, it's a successful design. So if you've intentionally broken a rule and people can see that you broke that rule intentionally, you have created a nice design. The thing is, if you don't know which rules to break, then how can you intentionally break them, right? There's a whole thing like learn the rules before you break them. It's cliche, but it is actually true. So what I would say is if you, for example, say, yeah, I want to break the big Venus model, I want to just create a nice rhythm, every shape is the same size. Sure, that exists in designs, but make sure it's very intentional, exaggerate, make sure that is what you're aiming for. And then suddenly you have a design that still works, even though it's broken the rules, right? Technically. So that's the way I look at it. Intention is everything in design. If something doesn't look like it's intentional, it looks like a mistake, which is why it is dangerous to break the rules. Because if I don't know how to break the rules successfully, most of the things I'm trying to do are going to look like a mistake. Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm a big proponent of this idea that I think you said at the start of your PowerPoint, a big core element of a concept artist's job is this idea of exploration, and not just limiting that exploration to within a design process, but exploration in terms of your own painting, right? Your own work. And I know for a fact, the same as me, a part of that exploration might be that you sit down just in your own time and you do a study where you deliberately try and break some of the rules and see if you can get it to work.
Yes.
And play around
Absolutely.
with it. Yeah.
I do believe my girlfriend locked herself out, so I'm quickly going to open the door and be back in 2 minutes. I'm so sorry for the interruption, but I'll be back in a second.
I think that brings us pretty much to a nice close anyway, doesn't it? Unless there's anything else in terms of topics that you would like to bring up, Joe.
I don't have any particular questions, unless anyone in the chat has any questions that they want to ask last minute. I think we might be finished. But yeah, it's been good. It's been very good.
It's been interesting to hear from somebody with a very sort of unorthodox approach to getting into the industry, which definitely makes a nice change to hear about. So last chance for anybody that's got any questions in the comments. We'll give you another moment or so. But thank you very much, Arne, for your time, and thank you, Joe, for organising this talk as well. It's very important to get a sort of a nice breadth of talks on games within these sorts of types of online conferences. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks everybody for joining us. We hope that you will join us again later on at 5 p.m. for our third industry guest talk of the day with the winner of Adobe's Meet Map 2 competition and mid-level material artist at Frontier Developments, Nikki Marinoff. So one very much worth a watch for any sort of 3D artists that may be in the viewers as well. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.